So John, why don't you do the introductions?
Yep. Yeah, so it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Hotaling. He's currently a postdoc at Washington State University, but he will be moving to Utah State University to start a lab this summer. So he'll have a faculty position there, a permanent position there. And his research is looking at mountain ecosystems, and one of the topics he looks at is how retreat of glaciers and snowfields impacts biodiversity in mountain environments. And so Scott is going to talk with us about high mountain biodiversity under climate change today. So take it away, Scott.
Sweet. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
So I'm super excited to talk with you all. I mean, obviously wish I could be there in person as I love Boulder, but we'll do the best we can from afar. So yeah, I'm going to talk about what I've been working on for a long time now, which is thinking about A, what lives in mountain ecosystems, because we don't have the best handle on it. And then B, what does it mean as these ecosystems change really rapidly for biodiversity therein, whether in a stream or actually on a glacier itself. And so this is one of my study sites in the Teton range. This is the outflow of the Middle Teton Glacier in Grand Teton National Park. And if you want to follow along with any of this stuff in the future or connect about this stuff, I post a lot about my mountain work and field work and stuff on Twitter. And so I recommend, encourage people to connect with me there if you're interested. And so before getting into the actual talk, a quick advertisement. As John said, I will be moving to Utah State University in the fall to their Department of Watershed Sciences. And I would love to have people that want to collaborate or come work with me. And my lab will be focusing on mountain biodiversity, impacts of glacier loss and climate change in the Western US. It'll have a lot of management implications and links to stewards of these landscapes, both in terms of water resources and ecology. And Northern Utah is a really beautiful place to live with some really, really good skiing right out of your backyard. So feel free to get in touch via Twitter or email. So I don't have to belabor this point to this group. You all are some of the world experts in actually tracking how climate change is dramatically altering the planet, particularly as it relates to the cryosphere. This is sea ice over the last 40 years. You can see that it's getting, much less thick and much less broad in area. The same is happening in the high mountain areas. So this is a slide that I like to show, one of just the classic glacier loss before and after photos, which are so depressing, but also so salient to illustrate these points. So this is the Boulder Glacier in the northern part of Glacier National Park. Back in the 30s, it was a pretty big ice mass in the park, and there, you can see some people standing here. And by 1988, so in just about 60 years, the Boulder Glacier completely receded, or there's about 2% of it left at this point. And so what I think about is, and what I study is, what does that mean for the actual glacier environment? Obviously, if you lose a glacier and you live on the glacier, that's a pretty big deal for your well-being. But also, there's a stream that runs along here, Boulder Creek, and it's still flowing today from this area. And you can imagine that there was this just massive hydrological physical shift in this environment over 6 decades, where it went from, we're talking downstream. Here it was covered by ice, but downstream, there's a really strong, probably seasonal glacier flow, lots of turbidity, very cold water. And now the flow is likely much lower. I'm sure it's warmer, and it's likely much less turbid. And so what does that mean for the biodiversity there? How can it evolve? Can it evolve quickly enough to deal with these kind of rapid shifts? And what species may be gained in a stream like that or lost based on that outcome? And so I'm giving this talk to a really general audience. So if you're an ecologist, sorry for being so dumbed down. If you're a hydrologist or a glaciologist, sorry for not going too much into your weeds. I'm treating this as a really general take. And so just to give you some perspective, mountains are really well-known biodiversity hotspots. And a big part of that is this habitat zonation that occurs where you have one unit of area, but it's spread into all these different ecosystems, from forests all the way up to ice. And when we look at surveys of global biodiversity, this is mammals, birds, and amphibians, but the same could be done for insects or plants or whatever. We see that mountains have this concentration of species where a much smaller total area contains a higher proportion of species relative to other places on the planet. And so in this discussion of mountains as key biodiversity hotspots, we tend to overlook the actual glaciers. So there was this really wonderful study by some colleagues a few years ago that looked at the global impacts of glacier loss on biodiversity. And it was a really great paper, and I totally commend them. And some other colleagues and I wrote a response to it because we wanted to highlight that the actual glacial ecosystem has its own biodiversity that will also be lost under climate change. And so in this talk, I'm going to give you two vignettes, one on terrestrial environment, so the actual like surface of a glacier, focus on the Western US, and then one on aquatic environments and what happens there. And so a big reason why I am here, I think one of the reasons John invited me and that people asking about glacier biodiversity is I study this creature called an ice worm. And I bet there's a much higher proportion of people at the National Snow and Ice Data Center that know about ice worms. But to give you some perspective, these are ice worms, and they can be, this is on the Paradise Glacier of Mount Rainier last summer, and they can be extremely dense on the landscape. And we know very little about the ecology, physiology, etc. of ice worms. And as you can see, though, like it's a fairly species and biomass poor environment, yet there are hundreds of millions of worms on a given glacier. And so that's a pretty big impact that we don't really know what it's doing. I mean, we don't really know how these ice worms affect nutrient cycling, predator-prey dynamics, how they live there. So I spend a lot of time working on that and thinking about that. And if you're curious, there was a really nice NPR story last summer about ice worms that I was a big part of. And it's a really nice like 6-minute listen that you can track down by just Googling like my name and ice worms. And I'll talk a lot about this habitat and what it means. So to give you a bit more ice worm perspective, they are annelids. So they're close cousins of the earthworms you find in the soil in your backyard. They basically treat the upper layer of a glacier or snowfield, that kind of softer snow, the way regular earthworms treat soil. They're one of only 2 ice worms in the world. The other is known from Tibet, although we know essentially nothing about it. It was observed in the 70s, and we haven't heard anything else in at least published literature since then. They're considered cold stenotherms, and that means they can only handle a really narrow thermal range, roughly from a little below freezing to a little above freezing. I put red question marks as foreshadowing. We don't think that's totally true based on some physiological evidence. They can live in water just fine. So I call them terrestrial here, but they're really aquatic, I think, or at least semi-aquatic. And they're found on coastal glaciers from, this is the Western US, all the way up to Southern Alaska. All these green circles are where ice worms have been found. And they tend to not be in these more peripheral glaciers that we think don't get enough snow to insulate them during kind of key shoulder season areas. And they probably freeze to death, which I'll tell you more about that too. And so one of the first things that I wanted to do with ice worms, as someone who studies the population genetics of organisms, which tells you essentially using their DNA to ask how related different populations are, I wanted to go out and actually see how much gene flow, how related are ice worms across, across their range. And so we sampled ice worms from these 10 sites across that range. And we first just asked how similar they are. And I'm coloring them here by their genetic similarity. And as you can see pretty quickly, and I'll show you some figures to help illustrate this, don't worry about interpreting these. I'll tell you what you need to know. I recognize this is not a genetics audience. So these colors correspond, these are populations, and each little circle over here, or point on here, column or row, is an individual. And they are grouped by who they are the most similar to. And we see a really normal pattern. The closer you are geographically to another population, the more genetically similar you are, likely because there's been less time for you to diverge evolutionarily. In the population genetics world, we call that isolation by distance. And so that's all well and good. Iceworms totally fit that model, except for this little guy. So there was this one worm from Vancouver Island that its most close relative was up here in southern Alaska. And so my first thought when I saw that, and we have a couple different lines of evidence that suggest this is true, is that it must have been some kind of sampling mistake or something, and we mislabeled something. But we went back through all the tubes and all the kind of approach, and there's really no way we could have mislabeled those two tubes. The data were actually collected, the same data were collected at different times. So that really they weren't even in the same pools of data collection. And so I also went to the literature, and I knew that there had been some reports with less fine scale data of similar weird patterns. Like there had been some worms from over here, from this island, Baranof Island, that had been reported as being really similar to some southern Alaskan worms. And I have a colleague who works on the Olympic Peninsula, and they also have this weird Alaskan genotype on the Olympic Peninsula. And so totally different data sets had seen something similar. So I think it's real. And so the question becomes, well, how do we explain this unidirectional southern Alaska to coastal British Columbia down to North America, to Western US pattern of migration of worms? These worms cannot, travel across those distances. This is like 2,000 kilometers between these two. And so we think it's birds. We think birds are mediating this dispersal. It seems to be quite recent. So like, at least in the case of our Mariner Glacier worm, it's likely only a few generations old that worm is removed from Alaska. So sometime in maybe the last decade. So there's really no way it's like an ancestral glaciation or something. And this pattern generally follows the Pacific Flyway, which is a migration route of birds. And it's only north to south, likely because of seasonal snow patterns. In terms of like, when you're going back north, there isn't the same habitat available for a migrating bird to stop over on. So what we think is probably happening is this is how annelids reproduce. They create this little sticky egg sac. And this is a figure from an older paper. And then I added, we think that egg sac likely gets stuck somewhere on a bird and then is transported potentially between glaciers along that area, because we know birds will stop over in these areas. And so I see a question from Mark in the chat. The iceworms taste good. I have eaten an iceworm. It's kind of a rite of passage of iceworm scientists. They don't taste like anything. They are very small. And so, but they are super lipid rich. And so we think that they could be a really useful energy source for these migrating birds. And as you'll see, we have a little bit of evidence for this, or a lot of evidence. This is a gray-crowned rosy finch, a high elevation nesting bird in North America. And this is a gray-crowned rosy finch eating an iceworm. And so we see this commonly, that we have seen probably 7 or 8 species of birds eating iceworms. And as you can see, this is not even a particularly dense iceworm emergence for the day. And there are still so many iceworms that you can't even walk on the glacier without stepping on one. So it's not hard to imagine that one could get in the downy feathers occasionally of a bird and be transported. And so moving on from iceworm distributions, we're really curious about their thermal tolerance. And iceworms are the largest organism on Earth that spends its entire life cycle in ice. And it's pretty unique because, as you can see from those previous photos, like, they're very much macroscopic. They're pretty big, and the bigger you get, the harder it is to deal with temperature variation. That's kind of like a general rule of biology. And so they're awfully big because they're spending all of their life in ice. I mean, other organisms don't do this. And so this is from a paper by John Edwards, who's kind of a hero of mine. from back in 1985, where this paper is very short and doesn't have any methods in it or anything about where the worms are collected. And Dr. Edwards had this phrase that ice worms are autolysed on continuing exposure to temperatures above 5 degrees Celsius. So basically they just melt in your hand. And that's always been the prevailing theory of ice worms. They can handle the cold, but if you put them out at room temperature, kind of like pica, they just die. And so Katie Marshall and I, Katie's an ecophysiologist at University of British Columbia, we put this idea to a very simple test. We got a bunch of ice worms. They'd been sitting at 4 degrees, acclimating on ice for a couple of days, and we just exposed them to set temperatures. And we showed that if you bring these ice worms below 0 degrees, even down to -5, it's 100% lethal. Ice worms cannot handle anything less than -5 degrees, at least the ones we collected in Washington at that time of year. But interestingly, we took those same worms and we started just ramping up, higher and higher temperature exposures. And we found that not only can they handle 5 degrees Celsius just fine, they can handle room temperature, basically like 25 degrees Celsius. And they only really start to die and have tissue breakdown at around 27 degrees Celsius, which is really quite warm. So that kind of turned their physiology idea on its head a bit. And so then we took it a little further. And we wanted to investigate this idea of, can they tolerate freezing? So over here, we just did a temperature exposure. We didn't test specifically that the tissue is actually freezing. And so most cold adapted species in places like, in and around glaciers can handle some amount of freezing. It's a really dangerous game if you live in a place like a glacier and you can't freeze at all. And it turns out ice worms can't freeze. So even being frozen at just below 0 degrees Celsius, so this was at -0.5 degrees Celsius, this is 1 minute, half of them completely died. The ones that didn't die were really severely injured and likely were going to die. So ice worms can't freeze. They are living at the absolute lowest minimum of what they can tolerate in the wild, which is really crazy. And so we moved on to the next idea, which is any of you that have been on glaciers on a nice bluebird day, you know that these are some of the most UV intense places in the world. So we wanted to actually see how much UV can ice worms tolerate. Are they unique in that way? They're really, really darkly pigmented. And so we expected their values to be quite high. But what we found was much higher than we ever would have dreamed of. So on the x-axis here is UV tolerance. This is the lethal exposure for 50% of a population value. So it's just like a total value that essentially kills half of the animals in your sample. And so many of you might know about tardigrades, which are kind of considered to be one of the toughest organisms in the world. There's always papers about sending tardigrades to space and all this kind of stuff. The tardigrades, or at least this species, can handle about 61.2 kilojoules per meter squared of UV before they die. The highest, so I was working with Craig Williamson, and he's done this for a lot of organisms, mostly from high mountain areas. The highest value he has ever observed for an invertebrate is for this species from a high mountain lake in the Andes, lives about 17,000 feet, and they can handle about 1/16. And for vertebrates, the highest he's ever seen are embryos of the cascade-tailed frog, which live in really high elevation streams and stuff in the Western US. And so ice worms are the highest value his lab has ever seen, 7 times higher than tardigrades, 4 times higher than the highest invertebrate we've ever seen. And this was actually about an LE20. So this wasn't even quite the value that would be a true LE50 of the population. That is likely higher. They were essentially running out of the ability to add more UV to the test. So there's something really exciting going on with ice worm physiology. So lately, I've been trying to move on a bit from ice worms, or I've been expanding from ice worms, because there's still this higher level question of as a glacier goes away, what biodiversity are we actually losing? You know, we talk a lot about how as a rainforest goes away per acre, there are X number of undescribed species or things like that. And so it turns out that we really have no clue what animals actually use glacier ecosystems. And if we look at what melts out of glaciers around the world, there are a lot more organisms that are, you know, parts of them are locked up in glacier ice than we would ever dream as being part of those ecosystems. So following the footsteps of a great paper by Jorgen Roswald a couple of years ago, he went out and just did a meta-analysis of all of the literature about ice and snow biodiversity and simply asked how many birds and mammals use these habitats. And so things like reindeer, getting refuge, things like rock pigeons that are up there like either feeding or nesting. And he came up with this list, and he, you know, looked at what, you know, which categorized their behaviors, but really just focused on how many there are. And he identified globally, there are 17 mammals and 19 birds that are known to use glacier and snow ecosystems. And these are things like humans, birds like that great crowned rosy finch I mentioned earlier, and other kind of well-known pika taxa. And so we wanted to see if that was really true. And unfortunately, this figure appears to have lost a lot of its sheen. I'm hoping that is only this one, but hopefully you can still see, at least on my screen. So we went out and we went to the Paradise Glacier and we set up an array of wildlife camera traps, 6 of them along the margins of the glacier. This is Mount Rainier in Washington. And so here's our trap sites in June, the glacier kind of looking at some satellite imagery, you can see how much snow and ice there is. And then later in August, here they are actually next to the glacier margins itself. And so working on a glacier and trying to monitor wildlife or find it presents a problem because we want to stay near the kind of snow rock edge. And during the summer season, the snow rock edge dramatically changes. Like the Paradise Glacier, the surface lowers by like 20 feet during the summer because there's so much snow there. So we needed to have a camera trap that was actually movable. And so this figure looks a little bit better. And so this is our very high-tech solution to this. We took an igloo cooler, like you would take to your kid's soccer game, and we filled it with snow and ice, just from around the area. And then we we duct taped it with camo duct tape and attached a wildlife camera to it and tucked these at different intervals along an elevational gradient on the glacier. This is what it looks like from afar. They're pretty hard to spot. They blended in quite well, although plenty of climbers and skiers found our cameras and had some funny photos on there for us, although no one messed with them. So another great vote for the mountain outdoors community. They were very excited about our stuff, but no one messed with it. And these cameras worked shockingly well. And so here's a raven on the glacier. Here are some skiers going for a tour. Here's a little mountain bluebird, a mountain goat. This is a Cascade red fox in that shadow. Here's a marmot. Here's a white-tailed ptarmigan. And then our kind of best shot of the whole season was a wolverine ascending the glacier. Part of a family of wolverines that was only the 3rd confirmed wolverine family in the Southern Cascades in 100 years. So we only put out 6 cameras and we learned a lot. And so a great reminder of how powerful this kind of approach can be. And so when we actually look at the data, this is going to be temporal. So these are cameras by elevation, higher to lower. And throughout the season, we see a lot of humans are using the glacier in June, mostly because the skiing is quite good in late June on Mount Rainier. So lots of humans there. And note the humans have a different y-axis than the rest of the data I'm going to show because there were just so many human observations in the early season. But then if we move to carnivores, non-carnivores, and birds, we see this later season pattern where generally these species are moving into this area as snow melts off. So more like summer, they're getting a lot of use out of it. And then, and as you go higher, there's pretty much no real discernible pattern, especially for birds. They're kind of using the glacier fairly uniformly throughout the year. And so when we go back to that Rosswald table and compare our results, so we identified something like 16 species total. 8 of these are new species, air quotes, that are associated with a glacier. So a 22% increase in the number of known taxa that are associated with mountain snow and ice from a single glacier with a very minimal camera design in one summer. So to me, that suggests that like if we did this around the world, we're probably underestimating the number of species that actually rely on glaciers for various aspects of their life history by like orders of magnitude. And so what this has kind of informed and made me start thinking more about is this multi-level food web on mountain glaciers. So in places like in the Northwest, where there are ice worms in particular, you can imagine that there's this kind of microbial base of the food web, which is, you know, things like bacteria, snow algae, primary producers. Then there are ice worms, which we know feed on snow algae and other organic material in the snow. Then there are things like the gray-crowned rosy finch that are up there eating ice worms. Then there are species like the American kestrel. This is one of our study photos that are there, and we've seen them actively hunting things like rosy finches that are feeding on ice worms on the glacier. So they're hunting those small songbirds on the glacier. And we've noticed that those things like rosy finches tend to stay close to the margins of the glacier. And we wonder if that's because the more you get out into the middle, the more just like a sitting finch you are for some kind of bird of prey. And then we know there are wolverines that are up there hunting things like marmots, maybe kestrels, just stuff that's already up there as well. So there's like this kind of 5 levels of this food web. And so now I want to switch gears and talk about aquatic biodiversity, and specifically the outflow of glaciers and similar streams throughout the West and the biodiversity therein, and how it might be changing under climate change. So this is Lednia tumana, the meltwater stonefly. It lives in Glacier National Park in Montana. It has been listed under the Endangered Species Act for climate change induced habitat loss. And it's representative of this broader community of aquatic organisms. I'll go back a little bit. This is a caddisfly that live in the same areas. So there's just kind of this big community, relatively, of aquatic invertebrates that live in these really cold waters in North America and around the world. And so Lednia is kind of our poster child of this bigger community level question. And so the question surrounding them is, why do they live there? How do they live there? And what does loss of glaciers mean for the future of potentially endangered taxa like Lednia tumana? So to give you a bit of a primer on mountain stream biodiversity and how hydrology impacts it, it's pretty well known that the heterogeneity of hydrology drives the diversity that we see in mountain landscapes. And to give you some examples of that, this is an Ecuadorian volcano where you have a glacier-fed stream on the left, very cold and turbid, right next to a stream that's fed by a groundwater aquifer that is much more stable and clear and has more primary production within it. And there are streams like the Middle Teton glacier-fed stream that I work on a lot that you can barely even tell where the stream bed is. It's so turbid and steep and super cold. And then they're in the same range, you know, a kilometer away, there are rock glacier-fed streams, which have similar temperatures to glacier-fed streams, but they're much more stable and clear and consistent. And so the prevailing idea around how climate change will impact mountain glaciers and how that will translate to biodiversity loss for aquatic organisms is that loss of glaciers means loss of these cold adapted specialized species that live in their meltwater. So this was a survey of 3 different areas using space for time. So they went out and sampled habitats, and they quantified how much glacier coverage there was in the catchment, how many species are there, and how that compares to other catchments in the same area. And they showed that essentially glacier coverage meant loss of individual species. While you see more species in areas that don't have glaciers, there's a more diverse community, you lose these specialized species consistently when you lose those glaciers. But this was space for time. This was not temporal data. And so there's this kind of basic research and conservation challenge here. So we lack some basic understanding of what's going on in these mountain stream or otherwise systems. You know, for species like Lednia and other stoneflies, Aquatic glacier, that has also been listed on the Endangered Species Act for the same reasons. They've gotten a lot of press about it. We need more robust tests of biodiversity loss in space and time. While it's great to go out and sample a gradient of glaciation and use that to get some idea of where species are living and how, you know, the loss of that ice mass might impact the community, you lose a lot when you just compare stuff with a snapshot across drainages versus temporal monitoring of an individual drainage or having some kind of temporal data. And then there's a really difficult challenge of understanding the actual genetics of organisms, how that relates to their ability to withstand super cold temperatures or other aspects of these environments, to ultimately figure out what actually threatens these species. And I'll kind of touch on that a bit, but one of the kind of high level takeaways is that consistently with things like Lednia tumana, this cold associated stonefly with iceworms, we keep seeing that while we assume that these really cold temperatures are what these species require for their survival, that in reality, they can actually handle much warmer temperatures than they ever experienced in the wild. So that raises questions about, well, if it's not temperature, is there some kind of biotic threat where there's like a predator-prey dynamic or a resource use question that might actually be more informative to predicting what will happen to them under climate change, and not just focusing so much on temperature. And so to illustrate this, here's like a present day mountain stream system with a bunch of snow feeding it. And we know that there's, you know, some amount of flow, there's some amount of dissolved oxygen, there's UV, there are all these aspects which affect an organism's ability to survive there. And we can predict how those things might change in the future. So we know temperatures will rise, but we also know that oxygen supply might increase, but that might not outpace oxygen demand. You need more oxygen when you're in a warmer environment for metabolic processes and things. We know flows will decrease, and we know UV will increase. And so how does that kind of complex, how do all these factors interplay to influence where a species lives and what might happen to it? And so we've done a bunch of work to address this. I'm only going to have time to tell you about one of those kind of higher level perspectives. And so to orient you, here is a stream in Glacier National Park. These are data from a paper we published a few years ago, where we were looking at a suite of organisms, but mostly this endangered species, Lednia tumana. And we showed that essentially, if you're right up here, a couple hundred meters from the glacier, where these are temperature profiles, the temperature of the stream is roughly flatlined at 0 degrees, even in summer. These Lednia tumana stoneflies make up about 40% of the community. But as you move downstream, and this is the total number of species that are there, so there's 19 species there. But if you move downstream to these warmer streams, Lednia makes up only about 10% of the community. And now we're getting in the range of 2.5 times as many taxa. So you move downhill, there are more taxa, but there maybe aren't as many or as common of those specialists. And so the idea is that when glaciers recede, species will be lost, and that on regional scales, this will mean extinction of endemic species like Lednia tumana. And so we performed a pretty Herculean test of this idea in Glacier National Park in Montana. It took about a decade to pull together. And so here's our study area, Glacier National Park, and all these circles are sites that we sampled. And so we went out and we did quantitative sampling of the entire invertebrate community in these stream sites for 129 places in 36 catchments. And then we also, with our USGS glaciology colleagues, we mapped all of the present day ice in the park. And we were able to use that to calculate glacier cover change since the Little Ice Age. So essentially over the last 170 years, for every point, we could say, what is the history of the glacial ice at this spot? And what's the present day species community? And so to give you an example of what some of these sites look like, here's the Sperry Glacier, a pretty well-known spot in Glacier National Park. Yellow is the Little Ice Age extent of the glacier. You can see the modern day. White is modern day, that's the ice. And then these red circles are our actual sampling location. So we pretty densely sampled many of these locations throughout the park. So here's the Boulder Glacier I mentioned earlier, the Grinnell Glacier, and we have lots more like that. And so our first point was we wanted to do some basic checks of patterns that we saw in the data, which we know should be there from other studies in similar places that maybe weren't as fine scale of data, but were similarly conducted. And so we first saw the pattern that species richness is higher with less glaciation. And that's been seen around the world, and it's generally a pattern that holds true. And we also see this pattern of biodiversity, which is how similar one community is to another community. So like if you think of like taking two sites, how much overlap is there in the community? Really high, like a value close to 1, means essentially no overlap between those two communities. A really low value, 0, essentially would mean complete similarity. And we saw this pattern that at lower glacier cover, you have lower biodiversity. So the individual communities are more similar to each other at lower levels of glaciation. And there's a really prominent paper from about 15 years ago now, by Lee Brown and colleagues, where they calculated a similar thing. And if we flip one of their plots around to make it match our plot, we see essentially the same pattern. That was a good sanity check of our data set. So then we took this approach called latent Dirichlet allocation, which I would have to remind myself how exactly this works. It was developed for like word graph theory. And we applied this to this ecological question of essentially, can we take all of our data and all of what we know about these sites and parse it into communities that are maybe associated with different aspects of the landscape? And the best fit to our data were 2 aquatic insect communities, a cold water community that we found only in these kind of glacier-fed streams, or at least mostly there, and then a community that we consider more of a thermal generalist. And so we can look at the relative abundance of species within these communities, and we see that things like Lednia what I've talked about earlier, are really strongly associated with this cold water community. And there are species like Orthocladius that we see essentially everywhere, except at the highest reaches, and it's in this kind of more thermal generalist community. And so we then took our data set and we asked, okay, we know that a bunch of our streams are still currently glaciated to varying degrees. And we know that some of our streams do not have any present day surface glaciers or ice. What is the proportion, the abundance of this cold water community across those sites? And we saw this kind of pattern of among the glacial streams, this cold water community tends to fall off at lower levels of glacier cover, but the data are really noisy. But the really interesting thing here is this right side of the plot. Now, hopefully you guys can see my mouse. These non-glacial streams actually have a varying amount of this cold water community. So there are actually sites that do not have present day glaciers, yet have a really high abundance of this cold water community that's still persisting there. And then if we look at like distance to source, we see also that glaciers are essentially buffering this cold water community, where if you're much closer to the glacier, there's a higher proportion of that cold water community. But if you go downstream to 3 or 4 kilometers away from the glacier, that cold water community kind of rapidly falls off. And it's even faster for these non-glaciated headwaters. And so the kind of money point of this is this cold water biodiversity appears to be persisting in headwaters of Glacier National Park, in some headwaters of Glacier National Park, 170 years after a glacier goes away. And so to show you what that looks like, these are all of the sites that either in green have had no glaciers as far as we know since the Little Ice Age, so for 170 years. And then in yellow, these are sites that have lost their glaciation over the last 170 years, and we don't know exactly when, but we know they've lost it. And so what we would expect going into this is that all of these points would be way to the left over here, and that essentially virtually all of the sites that don't have present day glaciation have a very low amount of this cold water community. So here, this is the relative abundance of what we sampled of one community versus the other, as we can actually parse it out from our data. But instead we saw this U shape where this was what we expected, but then there were these sites where 40% of sites that have lost their glaciers to the Little Ice Age had this really high abundance of this cold water community. And to simplify this a little bit and maybe show it in a way that is a bit easier to just easily see, all of the streams in our data set, 129, we found 112 total taxa. And all of the streams without ice, so 50, we still saw 110 taxa. So this really contradicts the prevailing theory that the loss of the glacier will essentially mean rapid loss of cold water associated biodiversity, species like Lednia tumana. And we actually have some ecophysiology data that supports this, that shows that Lednia tumana, for instance, can handle much warmer temperatures than we would ever expect based on its distributions in the wild. So their kind of commonness in these headwaters and their rarity outside of these really cold headwaters might have something to do with their actual, more about their resource use or the food web or something else, and not so much their actual physiological preferences. But the results of this study kind of contradict what we would expect to happen in these environments. So the expectation is this idea of turnover, where you have like a really specialized cold water community up in these headwaters, maybe in 1850, and you have these more diverse lower elevation communities. And as the glacier goes away, you would lose these specialists, but you would gain new species there that would essentially shift uphill. And so what that would mean is that for a local site, one of these sampling spots, you would increase the biodiversity there. The species richness would go up. But on regional levels, you would lose biodiversity because you would lose these cold water specialists. Essentially, the landscape would become biologically homogenized. And this might still happen in a longer timeline, but we saw was more of what we think is a tolerance model, where you might have had this back in 1850, but in fact, that cold water community has persisted, perhaps despite the influx of a lower elevation community. Of course, we can't test this because we don't have, we haven't sampled the entire stream length going back to 1850, but this is what we think is probably happening. And essentially what you see in that case is the local richness increase at a given site as this warmer community shifts uphill, but the regional biodiversity has stayed largely constant over that time, which is a pretty big deal when thinking about biodiversity impacts. And so moving beyond space for time, we think there's a bit of a cause for optimism. And I certainly don't want to say that like glaciers won't affect biodiversity. What I mean more is that there might be some areas where we can look for kind of hope of where there might be ways to manage and at least preserve biodiversity into the near term, maybe not for the long term. And then also the actual causes of species declines may be more nuanced than we realize right now. We should be focusing perhaps less on physiology and more on resource use and more like competition and things like that. But I want to tell you about a project that we've been working on for a long time now called the Teton Alpine Stream Research Project. We began this effort in 2015. Summer 2022 will be our 8th year of continuous data, and it's a long-term monitoring of headwater streams in the Teton Range. And we select 3 different hydrological source types, so glaciers, snowmelt, snowfield-driven streams, and then what we call icy seeps, which is a catch-all term for anything that is fed by subterranean ice, so stuff like a rock glacier. And we're curious if biological rates of change depend on the hydrological source, and particularly if these rock glaciers and similar landforms are actually going to act as refugia into the future. And so we collect a bunch of biotic data, some core data about microbes and invertebrates that we have every single year. And then we have a bunch of abiotic data. So we have temperature loggers, we collect suspended solids, and we're now working with folks at National Park Service to actually have ideally annual or at least regular mass balance monitoring for our sites that have glaciers, including more remote imagery to quantify ice cover, and then also getting some annual flow data through time. And we have some really wonderful grad students that are working on this project. Taylor Price is working on the microbial aspect of it. And then Karen Jorgensen is doing a really wonderful study looking at the actual food web across these different stream types, which will inform our idea about what, how that might be a factor in predicting future changes. And so with the last couple minutes, I just want to hit on this idea about rock glaciers and cold rocky landforms as refugia. I think it's a really important one, and it's one that fits really well at both at the biological and geological cryosphere science interface. And so as all of you probably know, there are a lot of rock forms in the landscape that can hold either cold conditions or ice. I'm going to focus here on rock glaciers. There's about 73,000 of these, presumably worldwide. They globally outnumber glaciers and snowfields by a number of about 2 to 1 in the American West. They're changing more slowly than surface ice features due to their debris cover. This is actually some great work that folks at Boulder have actually shown. And this is just a little schematic of what that might look like for non-geomorphology folks. And they support representative biotic communities of, that are similar to those supported by glaciers, including some of these endangered species. And so Ben Goldfarb wrote a really nice piece about our work for National Parks magazine last year. And he put it really well that rock glaciers, long neglected by science, really long neglected by ecology, may help creatures from pikas to stoneflies endure climate change. And so what we're doing now is working with some USGS and Forest Service biologists to actually integrate these cold rocky landforms and this refugial idea into management goals and actually managing for these refugia, and if only monitoring them to see if what we think is actually true, but ideally also limiting as much human influence on them as we can. And so we've gone through and actually taken this climate refugia conservation cycle, which was published a few years ago, and taken some of our focal species and shown from a management perspective, how could you actually integrate these cold rocky landforms into their management? So this is one of those endangered stoneflies, the Aquatic glacier. We thought about this for American pika. We thought about this for some plants, and just this kind of more holistic integrating ecology and this rock glacier science into actual management of these landscapes. So some take homes. As we all know, climate change is dramatically altering the planet, in particular, these mountain systems. We lack a basic accounting of what lives in these places and the data needed to predict vulnerabilities. We've historically focused on physiology of organisms that we actually know to live there. There are plenty that we don't even know live there yet. And we need to broaden our scope to think more about like the actual biology and ecology side in order to think about what might threaten them. It seems that these glacier-fed stream communities may be more resilient than we previously thought, at least in the short term. But what we really need are long-term monitoring perspectives where we can actually track ecosystem, physical habitat change, as well as biotic change for the same locations through time to actually understand what is happening. And these in situ climate refugia that are on the landscape in the form of these cold, rocky landforms and their outflow streams may be a really crucial component of protecting biodiversity loss as the cryosphere recedes around the world. So with that, I will acknowledge some really wonderful people that have worked with me on these projects over the years. I appreciate all of you listening. If you want to contact me, here's my information up here in the top right corner, and I am happy to take any questions. Feel free to shout them out, or we can put them in the chat.